I love the Doyles so much. I love everyone here. This is such a fantastic event, largely because of the variety. So often with conferences like this, you'll sort of get a conference which is pro-Israel, parentheses, kind of anti-Arab. Or you'll get a conference that's about reaching out to Muslims, parentheses, and sort of touching on the oppressive state of Israel, this kind of thing. So to get a conference where you have such a variety and such a unity of spirit, it's a blessing. I just love this. And so again, thank you so much to Becky and Rob and Pastor David for not just for opening up his house, so to speak, but for having the heart behind it, the heart to do this. It's a tremendous blessing. And this was nuts, by the way. Look around the room. That was the most efficient lunch gathering thing I've ever seen in my life. What's that? Yeah, it was like boom. And I was able to force down. And actually, this is the way to do it. It's much better, by the way, to speak while everyone's eating, because about 15 minutes after you eat, that's the worst session. Because all of the blood is going from the brain down to digest, and everyone just starts, the video, Nelson's video with everybody sleeping, those are some good actors, by the way. I really thought they were sleeping. But so, at least with this session, everyone ideally will not be sleeping. So before I jump into my message, we're going to show a quick video. Now, let me say this. In 2 weeks, we're releasing a film called Sheep Among Wolves, Part 2. If you haven't seen Part 1, it's free online. Part 2 will also be free online. We release all of our films for free. But what we're encouraging people to do is gather together in groups, in churches, you name it, in people's homes, and have watching parties. So if you're interested, I'm going to show you the trailer here, and then if you're interested in signing up to be part of a watch party, if you don't have any friends, you can watch it at home. That's fine as well. You can sign up and watch it at home, but we're really encouraging people to get together. And so the website is sheepamongwolvesfilm.com. And if you just type in Sheep Among Wolves Film, you should be able to find the website, but it's sheepamongwolvesfilm.com, and it's about the underground church in Iran, and it's such a relevant issue right now, but one of the themes that we highlight in the film significantly is the fact that this fastest growing church in the world is in Iran, and it's largely, in so many ways, spearheaded. This is a very controversial issue right now by women. And I love watching these videos that come out of the Middle East, often having nothing to do with religion. Well, it does have to do with religion, but it has nothing to do with Christianity. But to see these fierce Kurdish gals fighting off ISIS, or to see these brave Iranian gals standing up to the religious leaders saying, "Don't you tell me I have to wear this head covering. You people have ruined our country, Nah, get out of my face." And, in a strange way, it brings tears to my eyes, like just the courage of these gals. They're the world changers. And then once they change the world, then the men take over and explain leadership is male. So thank you, ladies. But let's go ahead and watch the trailer, and then we'll jump into the message.
چه کشوری داریم خدمت میکنیم؟
So the first thing is in Iran, we know what country we're serving. We're serving the Islamic Republic of Iran.
میدونیم اگه ما رو بگیرن به اون تجاوز میشه، کتک میخوریم، حتی میکشن.
We know that if they get us, the first thing they will do to us as a woman is rape us, and then they'll beat us, and then ultimately they'll kill us.
و یه تصمیمه که جونتو بدی.
And this is the decision that we have made, that we want to offer our bodies as sacrifices.
برای اینکه امروز من از خونه میرم بیرون نمیدونم برمیگردم.
Because I have this thought when I wake up, when I leave that door, I might not come back.
من با همسرم حرف زدم و هر دوتامون اینو برای همدیگه حل کردیم.
And I've talked to my husband and we made an agreement that this is the decision of our lives, so if we leave that door, we don't come back, we accept the consequences of what happened. This is why there is an awakening inside of everyone, because it's a woman's woman.
Oh, the devil is gonna hang. Oh, the devil is gonna hang from his own ground. Oh, the devil is gonna hang. Oh, the devil is gonna hang. Oh, the devil is gonna hang from his own ground.
So you got the theme. We started out with the story of Haman in Persia, who ended up hanging on his own gallows. And so we've got this gal, Jess Ray, who released the song, which really didn't have anything to do with the underground church, but it was so gripping. We asked her if she would participate in the movie, so she came to Israel, and we recorded her singing this song, "The Devil is Gonna Hang on His Own Gallows," and it just formed the great backdrop for the film. So Sheep Among Wolves 2. So I'm going to go ahead and just jump right in. How many in the room throughout the late 80s, early 90s heard or saw videos, or since then have seen videos about this mountain in Saudi Arabia that a lot of people believe is the real Mount Sinai? How many people have seen videos about that? How many in the room have never heard this? Okay, so it's probably a third have heard or seen about this. So in brief, in the 80s, you had a guy named Ron Wyatt. He was an adventurous guy who would, on his own, travel all over the world. And he, through his studies, came to believe that the real Mount Sinai is in Saudi Arabia, as opposed to the traditional Mount Sinai, which is in the Sinai Peninsula in Egypt. And so he went there, and he got caught by the Saudi authorities. He actually got put in prison for about 3 months, and then made his way out. And then there were others that went throughout the 90s. There was a guy named Bob Cornuke, a friend of mine, and a couple named Jim and Penny Caldwell, incredibly sweet couple. They were working there in Saudi with Aramco, and they went up there 14 times with their kids and filmed hours and hours of video footage and just like thousands of pictures. And all of this stuff started sort of creeping out into the evangelical world, you know. You would have people talking about it in some of the conferences and so forth, and there were some videos made. But then for about really 10, 20 years, you sort of had the scholar response, where you had a lot of traditionalist scholars that really didn't like this idea. They said this is nonsense. There were accusations made, you know, about some of the folks that went and were investigating it. Well, these guys aren't archaeologists, they're not experts, and this sort of thing. So really you had this spike in interest, and then you had quite a few years of just, I'll just say, scholarly poo-pooing of this idea. Now, I'm not an archaeologist, I don't pretend to be. It's really not my thing. You know, I'm a missions guy. I love talking about the return of Jesus. I'm a speaker and this sort of thing. But over the years, when I'd seen some of these videos, because people come up to me at an event like this and say, "Have you seen these pictures?" And I go, "Yeah, it's interesting." I go, "It's actually kind of fascinating," but I'm naturally a pretty skeptical person. I don't just, you know, "Oh, I saw pictures, that must be true." But it was this kind of weird thing happened. Every time I would see something about this over the years, the Lord would just, this prayer would rise up in me. And I would say, Lord, I want you to get me in. I want you to get me into Saudi Arabia because I want to go check out that mountain. But also because behind the scenes, what I do in terms of ministry is working with the underground church in Iran, Afghanistan, that part of the world. I just said, Lord, I want you to open up Saudi Arabia. It's just been a prayer. Saudi Arabia has remained one of the most closed nations of all of the difficult to access nations in the world. Saudi Arabia has been incredibly closed. You really can't get in unless you have a work visa. So unless you're part of working for the oil companies, it's not like you can just go there easily on a tourist visa and, do any type of gospel work or this sort of thing. So this prayer would rise up in me, and it was really kind of strange because it was just out of the blue. And I always say, if the Lord just all of a sudden places some strange prayer in your heart, it sounds kind of crazy, just pray it. Because oftentimes that's not you, it's actually the Holy Spirit inspiring something. So about a year and a half ago, out of the blue, a friend of mine sent me some pictures, and he goes, hey, a friend of mine was just at this mountain in Saudi Arabia because he works in the oil industry. And I texted him right back and I said, can he get me in? Can he get me a visa? And immediately he said, yes, he would love to take you. And so I said, good, let's do it in 2 weeks. And then that didn't quite work out. But so it ended up being about 3 months later or so that we finally got in. But I'll tell you, the minute that he texted back and said yes, and I'm not a real super sensitive, woo-woo kind of spiritual guy in that sense, I could just feel the warfare, just like this heaviness. I was just like, whoa, what was that? And the warfare has just been incredible for the past, again, year and a half, almost 2 years now. And as soon as I felt that, I said, something is going on here. And so I've just sort of been walking through the doors that the Lord has been opening. So the end of April last year, got to go with a handful of guys and check out this mountain. So we're going to talk about Mount Sinai in Arabia, and then I want to talk about some of the prophetic implications, some of the things that I think God is doing behind the scenes with this. Because this story alone by itself is pretty fascinating, but I also like to look and say, but God, what are you doing beyond just this mountain? So let's go ahead and look at a map. From a biblical perspective, for Americans, I always say the slice of pizza-shaped peninsula. That's the Sinai Peninsula. Down there where the black triangle is, that is the traditional Mount Sinai. They call it Jebel Musa. They've believed that that could be possibly the real Mount Sinai from about the 4th century. Some monks started making the claim. About 200 years later, in the 600s, the 5th century, they built a fortress down there called St. Catherine's Monastery. And since then, tradition has basically said that's the mountain. But there's really no traditional, archaeological, or historical evidence. It's just something that sort of cropped up in the 4th century. Ironically, by the way, I think it's kind of funny, this tradition of these monks that had left Egypt, back in the 300s, the 4th century, because they wanted to escape the corruption of modern society. So they went out into the desert and gave themselves to prayer and so forth. This is the beginning of the monastic movement. And so how many can relate? Sometimes I just want to move out into the deserts of Texas somewhere. I guess that would be West Texas, and to get away from the corruption. But I don't think there's any place we can flee anymore. So anyway, that's the traditional site. Now, from a biblical perspective, Edom is from Teman in the north. That's basically southern Jordan. You can see Israel up there, all the way down into modern day Saudi Arabia. That's the region of Edom. And then you have that sort of area that hugs the coast on the eastern side of the Gulf of Aqaba, and that's Midian. So we just have to orient ourselves again as Americans. 85% of us when we were at war in Iraq, could not point to Iraq on a map. So I always like to use a lot of maps. Why is that area relevant or interesting? The Septuagint was the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament. It started being translated about 250 years before Jesus, about in the 3rd century BC. The Septuagint treats Midian like a city. When it refers to the elders of Midian, it uses a very specific Greek phrase, which is the city councilors. And there's a few other sort of anomalies within the Septuagint that lead scholars to say, well, whoever the translators of the Septuagint were, they believed that Midian was a city. Now, Josephus, okay, first century Jewish historian, also treats Midian like a city. He actually calls Midian a city. And then you had this Roman geographer, again in the 2nd century, so the 100s, named Claudius Ptolemy. And he did this incredible, we'll say it, a world geography in terms of his part of the world. And he places two cities over there on the eastern side of the Red Sea, or the Gulf of Aqaba. He calls one Madiama, the other one Modiana. So he has two cities which are similar in name to Midian. Now what's interesting is that Septuagint has a variation. Whenever it gets to the name Midian, it either calls it Madiam or Madian. Okay, so that's basically the same thing. Madiam, Madian. They just add the in that, I don't know if that's the Latinization, I'm not sure exactly where that comes from, but basically the idea was that by the 1st century, okay, now the 1st century is about 1,500 years after the Exodus, after the Jews left Egypt, there was this Jewish tradition that was also popular even among the Roman world, the Roman geographers, that there were two cities on the east coast of the Gulf of Aqaba that were understood to be Midian. Okay, so that's just a little bit of a backdrop. Now, this is a zoom in on the area today. You have two towns there. One is called Al-Bad. The other one is called Magna. These are two oases. I always blow this. These are two oases. I don't know. Oasis. They're both oases. Let's just do that. Al-Bad is a big oasis, about 20 miles. To the west is Magna. Al-Bad was on the ancient Arab caravan route. That whole area, again, this is Saudi Arabia, that whole area is just a desert wasteland, mountains, desert. You don't want to live there unless you live at the oasis, one of the two oases. And then just to the east and slightly north is a mountain called Jebel al-Luz, which means the mountain of almonds. This is the mountain that these guys were claiming is the real Mount Sinai, in which I have come to be thoroughly convinced. Because basically for the past year and a half, all I did is work through all of the scholarly literature, all of the critical literature, all of the historical evidence, the archaeological evidence, you name it. And the more that I worked through it, I went, these guys are just, a lot of these scholars are making some really bad arguments, and the case for this is overwhelming. Okay, so you've got a little bit of a grid on that area. And why did I point out Magna and Al-Bad? Because I believe that when Claudius Ptolemy referred to two cities, I believe these were the two places that he was referring to, because they're the only two places that people would have lived, right there on the coast of the Red Sea. Philo, who is a Jewish Alexandrian, he was influenced by Greek philosophy. He was a Jewish commentator that lived about the same time as Jesus. He said that Mount Sinai was the tallest, the loftiest, and the most sacred mountain in the district of Midian. Okay, so here's a Jewish tradition, again over there in Egypt, in Alexandria, during the life of Jesus, a Jewish tradition that said Mount Sinai is over there, not down there in the pizza-shaped peninsula in Egypt, but in modern-day Saudi Arabia. Josephus also, he said that Moses, when he had obtained the favor of Jethro was Moses' father-in-law, he married his daughter, Zipporah, when he stayed there, where? In Midian. Jethro lived in Midian. Okay, he fed his flock, he worked for his father-in-law. Sometime after, he took his station at the mountain called Sinai. And he drove his flocks there to feed them. This is the highest of the mountains thereabout. It's the tallest of the mountains near the city of Midian, or Madiam, right? So you have this Jewish tradition. One guy is over here in Jerusalem, that's Josephus. The other Jewish writer is over there in Egypt, probably two unconnected worlds in a lot of ways. The idea is that in the first century, during the life of Jesus, during the time of the apostles, the Jewish tradition held that Mount Sinai was over there in Saudi Arabia, not the traditional site. That's an important point. Why? Because this is the earliest extra-biblical historical tradition that we have as to the location of Mount Sinai. And it places it where? Over there in Saudi Arabia. Okay, so zooming in again on the map, what's the irony, so now I've changed the name of the mountain to Sinai. Of all the different candidates, because there's actually a handful of Mount Sinai candidates, this one gets attacked more than anything else. Yet this is the only one that has an ancient Jewish tradition attached to it. And then later, when the Christians came along, you had Origen, you had Eusebius, you had Jerome. They all, also in their writings, agreed with this Jewish tradition and said that that is the real Mount Sinai. And yet you'll never hear that in all of these scholarly critical articles. They'll never ever point out that this is where the earliest Jews and Christians believed it was. Now later, in the 7th century, when Islam comes along, they basically just continued that tradition. So the irony today is that most of the world rejects that this is the real Mount Sinai, but the Muslims today still believe it. If you look at some of the early Arab geographers, some of the early Muslim geographers, they all point to this as the real Mount Sinai. They just continued this ancient Jewish and then Christian tradition. So here's a couple verses. Exodus 2, verse 15. Moses fled from the presence of Pharaoh, and where did he go? Midian, right? We've already established that, and when he was there, he came to Horeb, the mountain of God. It was just outside of the district. It was just outside of Midian. The translation says the far side of the wilderness. Now, some translations will say on the western side, but that's actually an expression because the sun comes up in the east, it goes down behind you, and so sometimes when it says the west, all it means is on the other side, the far side. And so it's actually a more accurate translation to say outside of Midian, on the other side of the desert, was Mount Sinai. And it's about 20 miles or so away from Al-Bad, okay? That's the big oasis. Now, Moses, again, he left Midian with his father-in-law's sheep, and he went to Mount Sinai, right? Now, if the traditional site is where Mount Sinai is, that means that he took the sheep on a 500-mile round trip to go feed them. Because he didn't put them on a boat. Right? It's not like, come on, sheep. Like, they were essentially Bedouins. That doesn't make sense. Because the funny thing is, the scholars will say, well, that's ridiculous. The Jews never would have gone that far from Egypt all the way over there to Midian. That's crazy. People could never go that far. And then they go, oh yeah, Moses would have taken his sheep that far. No problem, it's easy. You go, well, which is it? Is it easy or nothing? And so again, I think that's unreasonable. On the other hand, if he took them the 20-mile, let's say 50-mile round trip maximum to feed the sheep, that makes sense. But we know where Moses started, and we know that he was just simply taking his sheep to feed the sheep, and he ended up at Mount Sinai. Now here's what's interesting. Another name in Arabic for Al-Bad is Muga al-Shu'aib. What does that mean? It means the name Shu'aib in the Quran is the name for Jethro. Muga is the caves. So the name of the city, the other name of the city is not just Al-Bid, it's Al-Bad or Al-Bid, I'm probably not pronouncing it good. It's the caves of Jethro. That's what it's still called to this day. So it's Jethro's house. That was the idea. Now, when you're there, right there in the center of the town, the Saudis have an archaeological park, essentially, and you'll have all of these caves. Now, these are Nabataean Caves, which means the Nabataeans were an Arab kingdom around the time of Jesus, and they came and sort of assumed these caves that were there previous. The ancient Midianite caves were then assumed by the Nabataean Arabs. The word Nabataean, by the way, comes from Nebaioth, who was the first son of Ishmael. Okay, so right there in the center of the town, they still call this the Caves of Jethro. It's an archaeological site. There's a French team that's there right now. So we went there, we went to the park, and when we stepped out, this view struck me. See the dark mountain in the back? That's Jabal Alaz. It's the tallest mountain in that whole entire part of Saudi Arabia. Okay, so again, according to the descriptions of Philo and Josephus, and it struck me as I stepped out of the cave, I said, if this is where Moses lived for 40 years, this is the view that he would have had when he stepped out of his house every day, Mount Sinai, having no idea that he was going to encounter God on the mountain in the most powerful theophany in all of human history, when God actually came down on the mountain, and there it is. It took my breath away. Like it was just a stunning view. Now, turn the volume up. This is when we are at the base of, that's Mount Sinai right there, that's Jabal Alaz, and there's a little gas station. This kid here is a Pakistani kid that works for the local Bedouins at this gas station. He speaks some Arabic, and I asked him, I said, what do you call this mountain right here? So I'm going to play this video, hopefully it works, and just want you to listen. Now again, remember, Jebel in Arabic is mountain. Laz or luz is almonds. How do you say Moses in Arabic? Musa. Musa. Okay, so go ahead and listen to this brief video.
Okay, so that mountain right there, is that, you say, Jabal al-Luz?
جبل هذا موسى هذا قرنير هذا المهري
So you call this one Jabal Musa?
جبل موسى
Okay.
So here,
جبل المهري.
so he's trying to name all the different peaks. So here's the funny thing. Is this dumb kid has been watching YouTube videos made by a bunch of dumb Christians saying that that's the real Mount Sinai. No, he hasn't been, that was a joke. The local Bedouins all call it Jebel Musa. That's what they call it. And I said, well, wait a minute, I thought it's called Jabal Luz. And he goes, no. He goes, this whole range is called Jabal Luz. That's, the peak is Jabal Musa. The local Bedouins have always believed it's the mountain of Mount Sinai, the mountain of Moses. Why? Because of this ancient Islamic, Christian, Jewish tradition. This kid has not been watching Ron Wyatt videos on YouTube. Okay, that was my joke. But that's what the scholars will say. All you dumb, gullible Christians, you watch these YouTube videos and now you reject archaeology. And I go, you guys are the ones that are ignoring the reality on the ground that there's this ancient Bedouin tradition which goes back to a Jewish tradition, and they'll never mention that in the critiques. They'll just poke holes and say, well, Ron Wyatt was a questionable character, this sort of thing. And I go, that is called an ad hominem attack, and you're missing the point. So here's a picture of the mountain. We got there, I want to keep an eye on time. We got there late at night, because we didn't know what we were going to encounter. And as we come to the valley, there's a valley right here, that dark valley. This is huge, by the way. The place is just massive. We walk across the valley, and as we get across the valley, I see this mural painted on the rocks. And I stop and I start taking pictures, and I go, hey guys, come here, look at these pictures. So here is a picture of some archers, right? And it's painted, ancient. It looks like something cavemen did, with red ochre paint, but they're clearly shooting arrows, and there's a whole bunch of them. There's about 30 archers. There's another picture of a bow and arrow. There's some more kind of spread out. And I texted my wife, because believe it or not, out in the middle of nowhere, I had cell service, which is unlike the street that I live on. And I texted my wife, and I said, check it out. We found these archers, and I texted Penny Caldwell as well, who Penny just knows about everything about the mountain that is, they just track with it because they just, they were bringing their children there 14 times, they just love this place. And Penny goes, I've never seen those. Where'd you get where were those pictures taken? And I was like, you mean I just discovered these? Here's Joel, I just show up, I got my backpack and my cell phone, and I'm an archaeologist. And I just stumble upon this thing that in all of the archaeological surveys, because the Saudis themselves have done This is not in any of the books, but I just, because the place is huge, and I was just kind of on the underneath of this rock. And then I texted my wife and I go, hey, look, I got these pictures. She goes, oh, wow, that's just like in the book of Exodus. And I said, what do you mean, woman? I'm the Bible teacher here. What reference are you talking about? She goes, yeah, it's just like Exodus 19. And she knew it like right off the top of her head. Look it up, son. So I looked it up. The Lord said to Moses, go to the people and consecrate them today and tomorrow. Have them wash their clothes and be ready by the third day, which, by the way, is the mikvah. This is like before a Jewish wedding, there's the mikvah, the ritual washing. Go have them wash themselves, because on that day, on the third day, the Lord is going to come down on Mount Sinai in the sight of all the people. Think about that. The creator of heaven is going to come down. Go freshen up. Put limits for the people around the mountain and tell them, be careful that you do not approach the mountain or touch the foot of it. Whoever touches the mountain is to be put to death. They are to be stoned or shot with arrows. And I was like, wait a minute. This might actually have some biblical relevance, because they're on these sort of mounds of rocks at the base of the mountain. It's the equivalent of basically, because I stopped at a gas station once. I was going to a conference in Texas, and in the gas station there was an assault rifle, and it said assault life, and then there was a Texas flag, and then there was something about Jesus, I forget. But anyway, you know the things that you can get that says this home protected by Smith & Wesson. It's basically what those were. Trespassers will be shot through with arrows. And he says, and put up boundaries around the mountain so that they will know. And by the way, this is just a little helpful tip. People always talk like, oh, the best weapon for home defense is this. Well, you don't want to use this. The best weapon for home defense is a dull bow and arrow. Because you always hear oh, I got shot, with like a .223. I didn't even feel it. I thought I got stung by a bee. No one ever gets shot by an arrow and goes, I didn't even know I got shot. If there's just an arrow sticking out of you, him and all of his buddies are gonna run. So you can, that's free advice. Elijah, but see, here's the thing though, that's a coincidence. It's a coincidence that there are paintings of archers at the base of the mountain, of which ancient Jewish tradition says the real Mount Sinai. That's a coincidence, Joel. You're not an archaeologist. 1 Kings 19, 8-9. Elijah, he arose and ate and drank, and he went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mountain of God. And he came there, and he came to a cave, and he went in there. And so if this is the real Mount Sinai, there should be a prominent cave somewhere. And sure enough, right on the face of the eastern side of the mountain, which is where the Israelites would have been camped, there is what? Oh, a cave. Well, that's interesting. It's not interesting. It's a coincidence. It's another coincidence. And certainly there can be multiple coincidences, of which this is just another one. So, of course, we went into the cave and ate. It's about 20 feet deep, and it's got a smooth sand floor. You could easily sleep in there. Here's a view looking out of the cave. You can see how high up we are, looking out at the valley below. And it's, again, if this is the mountain, then you would expect there to be a fairly significant, noticeable, prominent cave. And I'm sure there's plenty of caves on a lot of the mountains, but not all of them. And quite a few don't have caves, and this just happens to be there on the exact side where we would expect to find it. Skip forward a little bit. Exodus 24, verse 4-5. Moses got up early the next morning and he built an altar at the foot of the mountain. Why? Because the Lord told him to. And he set up 12 stone pillars, again, at the foot of the mountain, representing the 12 tribes of Israel. And then he sacrificed bulls and splashed blood on the altar, right? Because without the shedding of blood, covenants are cut with the shedding of blood. And then guess what? Right at the base of the mountain, well, looky there. There's an altar. And interestingly enough, from the cave, you could look down. Now, this is not the best picture in the world, but essentially this is 100 feet long, and it's these two corridors. And the Saudis have actually done an archaeological survey on this, and what they found were ashes, organic matter, bones, and things that you would expect to find if it was an altar. And then they concluded, well, it was probably a living quarters. And I went, living quarters? I was there. There's not a single doorway except for on the end. Okay? There's no windows, there's no doors. Like, what type of a living quarters is a long corridor that goes 50 feet and then turns and goes another 50 feet and ends at an altar? It's clearly an altar. And why does it turn, by the way? Is there anybody here that has been in the slaughter industry? That's a thing, right? Okay, so this is, come on, we're in Texas. Nobody here has ever slaughtered a cow? What's that? Boom. Because when Clarabelle is walking down the Green Mile, Clarabelle, you don't want her to see what's about to happen around the corner. Clara's like, what? We got a surprise for you, Clarabelle, come on. What? What's the surprise? And then she comes around the corner and, Allahu Akbar! So Moses didn't say that. And that's interesting, but it's also a coincidence. It's another coincidence. And it's also a coincidence, by the way, that there happens to be pillars right next to the altar, because that's also what's in the book of Exodus, but it's just another coincidence. And then about 200 yards from the base of the mountain is this massive pile of natural formation rocks. And carved into the rocks are cows, because what do the scriptures say? That they committed fornication, if you will, in the middle of the covenant. God's on the mountain, and they made a golden calf idol, and they start worshiping this golden calf and say, behold, this is the God that brought you up out of Egypt. And there's all these carvings all over the rocks of cows. Here's a close-up of another one that's just a little bit off to the side. And, again, you could look at this and go, well, they're pretty primitive. These are just hunting scenes, pastoral scenes. They don't really mean anything. Well, here's something that's interesting. Zoom in and see this picture right next to that bulging bicep? Just kidding. You've got this guy underneath the cow. It's a strange thing. Well, look, this is common to Egyptian iconography. It's part of the worship of Athis and Hathor, which are the gods that they were worshiping when they left. Okay, even the imagery there that you find in Arabia is clearly something that came from Egypt. No, those are just pastoral scenes. Well, yeah, it looks just like Egyptian iconography, but again, it's all just a coincidence. Do you see what I'm getting at? Like, you can just go down the line, and there's so many coincidences. Now, because of time, I'm going to sort of wrap up with looking, because I can show you all kinds of pictures. And the point is this. By the time I left, I was like shaking. It was one of the most faith-stirring experiences of my life. I don't know how to explain the experience of being there, but it completely shook me. Like, it was one of the most powerful experiences of my life. Now, from a biblical perspective, what does the Exodus represent? What does Mount Sinai represent? Most Christians were largely detached from how important this is. This is the single most looming, important mountain of revelation in the entire Old Testament. Everything is built upon the covenant at Mount Sinai, the Sinaitic covenant, or the Mosaic covenant. And what is the primary thing that the Lord is constantly declaring before and throughout and after the Exodus? What is the whole Passover centered around? Do these things so that you will remember. Remember, remember, remember. Remember the mighty things that I did when I led you out of it. Remember when I set you free from slavery. Remember when I ripped the ocean in half. When I split the sea. Remember how I cared for you. I provided water for you. Man, all these things. Remember, remember, remember. The prophets are constantly like, Israel, remember. I choked up when Eitan was showing the video when the Jewish guy from New York, he goes, and my mother read the scriptures and she said, God has been warning us over and over and over again. But she didn't grow up familiar with Tanakh. She didn't read those things. And that's exactly what you get when you study the Old Testament, when you study the Bible. It's God is reminding Israel and the world, remember. Because listen, guys, it's not every day that the God of heaven comes down out of heaven in front of the people. I know there's a mixed room, I mean, some people here say, well, miracles don't really, healings and things don't happen today. Some say they do. Look, I've seen some crazy things in my life. But even the miracles, even the crazy things, you can leave and go, are you sure that there's not a good explanation for that? The Lord always allows room for doubt. Why? Because he wants us to strengthen our faith muscle, right? He wants us, he can just rip the curtains open at any time and go, "Wah!" and we'd be like, "Whoa!" But he doesn't do that. He just does little peekaboos, right? Peekaboo, whoa! And then he leaves room for doubt because he wants us to trust him because it's about relationship, and relationship is built on trust, right? But that's not the way it was with the Exodus. He ripped the ocean in half. He came down on the mountain in a cloud that covered the mountain, in fire with the blasting of trumpets, with a mighty earthquake. The people were begging, Moses, tell him to stop talking, please. We can't bear it anymore. This is the one time in history that God came down and he goes, remember all of the crazy stuff? Now, if you look at the field of Exodus studies today, half of the scholars don't even believe the Exodus even happened. They don't even believe it happened. They go, that's all myth. Why? Because they're looking in all the wrong places. So I get on the plane as I was leaving Saudi Arabia, and again, I'm glowing. I'm just like, what just happened? And I'm sitting down I was in Amsterdam, sitting next to this guy, and immediately I could tell by his accent, New York Jew. And he goes, oh, where are you coming from? Did you just come through Zurich? And I was like, no, I just strangely just came from Saudi Arabia. He goes, what were you doing there? And I was like, well, let me show you some pictures on my phone. I think I was just at the real Mount Sinai. And he goes, oh, come on, you know none of that stuff's true. I said, what are you talking about? You're Jewish, right? Yeah, how'd you know? And I said, all right, do you go to synagogue? And he goes, yeah, I go to synagogue. Yeah, I'm observant, but German higher critical scholarship has disproven this stuff a long time ago. Yeah, the Bible's important, but that's not history. That didn't really happen. I'm going to read a verse here and then wrap this up. I think I've got it pulled aside. Talking about the Lord warning his people over and over and over again. You go all the way back to Deuteronomy 32. This is the Lord gives this song to Moses right before he dies, and this is really the foundation for so much prophecy. And the Lord is talking about the golden calf incident and all these things, and the Lord says, I was faithful, I did all these things, I cared for you, but then you turned away to idols. And in verse 17, he says, they sacrificed to false gods which are not God, gods they had not known, gods that recently appeared. That's not Johnny come lately, but gods that came lately. That was a joke. God, your ancestors did not fear. You deserted the rock. And then he says in verse 21, now look at this. They made me jealous with that which is not a God. They angered me with their worthless idols. Therefore, here's what I'm going to do. I will make them envious through a people who are not a people. I will make them angry with a nation, a foolish nation, or a nation that has no understanding. And I'm sitting on the plane with this Jewish guy, and I'm going, so you don't believe the story? And I'm going, but it's real. He's going, you don't know what you're talking about. German higher critical scholar. And I go, sir, with all due respect, German higher critical scholarship was a project that began, it was birthed with an anti-Semitic hatred of the Jewish people. The whole purpose of that was to de-Judaize the Bible. It was an anti-Semitic project. He goes, yeah, that's not true. And I was just like, well, it's kind of like, let's agree to disagree on that one. Look it up. And I'm looking at this, and he got really angry. And I said, all right, let's just agree to disagree. And by the way, the armrest is mine for the next 11 hours. But I'm looking at this, and I go, this is Deuteronomy 32 right in front of me. And I said to him, I go, look, I'm the Gentile here. You're supposed to be convincing me of these things. And instead, a foolish Gentile, which, believe me, is a very appropriate description, is making him angry. Sometimes we think provoking the Jews to jealousy is like these annoying Gentiles. Well, now we're less annoying because we're wearing kippahs and blowing shofars. Like, that's not annoying. And they're going to look and go, oh, wow, the Gentiles are blowing shofars. I want to be like them. That's not what Moses was saying, and that's not how Paul understood it. It's actually we're provoking them to jealousy and anger. God goes, you provoked me to jealousy with idols, therefore I'm going to use a bunch of stupid Gentiles, former pagans, that usually have no idea what they're talking about, and they're going to call you back to remind you of how faithful I have been, to remind you of all of these things. Now listen, with regard to Mount Sinai, I'm going to end it here. In a few months, I'll be taking the first Christian tour in history into Saudi Arabia. Becky and Rob are actually coming with me. The mountain is about to be open to the world for the first time in history. I've just been on this crazy journey where I got back from Saudi Arabia. Next thing you know, I'm on the phone with a Saudi prince, and they're saying, we want you to make a movie about that. I'm going, wait, what? The Lord is about to remind the world. The whole world is forgotten. We live in this age of runaway unbelief. Our own kids are becoming atheists. You know, I mean, it's like the whole world is becoming unbelievers, it seems like, here in the West. And the Lord's about to say, remember the craziest, most outlandish stuff? It's all true. And I preserved it and hid it away behind the Saudi Arabian Iron Curtain, so to speak, and he's about to open it up to the world. He's about to remind the Jewish people, remember the things that I told you to remember. And I believe it's not a coincidence that the Lord placed it right in the heart of Saudi Arabia, because he's about to testify to the Arab world, remember. He's about to wake up the nominal Christian church, remember. This book is true, completely true. Amen? Amen.